can't tell.
OK, can I just stop you for a minute, because I've got Margaret Hodge and John McDonnell over here in the other part of the studio here, and we will come back to all that because it's fascinating. Margaret and John, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Margaret, can I perhaps begin with you? Big night.
Enormous night. I never thought that we'd go from the very worst election defeat we ever had in 2019 to one of the very best election victories that we're looking at tonight. Can I just say something about turnout? Because I think this is really interesting. I was in Barking in 2001 when our turnout went down. It was a low turnout. And I did some work afterwards because I was concerned about that. So we did some focus groups on a particularly deprived council estate among women. What came out of that is that it's anger, not apathy, that keeps people at home. And I think that might be a factor today. We'll have to wait and see. The analysis can be done later. It was anger at that time. It was a Labour government and a Labour council. So it was anger against us at that point. Now, I think it is obviously anger against the Tory government and what has happened to people and their lives and the country and everything over the last 14 years. But I think we shouldn't think it's apathy. I think it's probably anger.
John, what is this new Labour Party that's going to have such a huge majority? Where does it sit? Is it very much Keir Starmer's party? Do you think the left will have a serious influence on the backbenches? How do you think it's going to shape up?
I just want to follow on from what Margaret has said, that the key element of this election was people want to get rid of the Tories. That was it. And the votes have gone wherever they thought they could be most effective in getting rid of the Tories. Some instances it's Labour, some instances Lib Dem. Worryingly, some instances gone to Reform, which I think is dangerous for democracy itself. What I'm worried about, well, we've got a Labour government coming in, huge problems. No government has ever inherited such a toxic mess from any predecessor. There's a limited programme they've put forward. I think a programme needs to be more radical eventually. This first wave of the 6 commitments that they've been given so far, we need to get underway quickly. Then I think the scale of the problems that we face demands something more radical. My worry is if we don't do that, disillusionment will set in, reform will feed off that, just as the far right have done right the way across Europe. So I think we understand the challenges, and I think having got rid of the Tories, people are up for that challenge.
Would you acknowledge that the clear lesson of tonight is that Keir Starmer was absolutely right to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn, to move Jeremy Corbyn on, and to effectively purge the party, as you would perhaps see it, of significant Corbynites?
I think it was a mistake. I can't agree with that. The reason we've won tonight is because people have had enough of 14 years of the Tories. Full stop.
But you've gone from a terrible election result to a massive triumph in a very short period of time.
We could never...
I would have given my right arm to stand against these Tories as they are now. The thing that turned is, just as the RM did in the past under Major...
But you were standing against Tories then, who you said were terrible people.
But we had Liz Truss. Liz Truss turned this a disaster. We had years of austerity, thanks to George Osborne and his crew. Then we had Boris Johnson, who was a congenital liar. Then we had Liz Truss, disaster, and that undermined the whole economic credibility of the Tories, and that was it.
I have to say, we would never be, John, in the position we are today if we had not absolutely reformed the Labour Party. And to be absolutely honest, much as I love you, you had your go. You had your go in 2019, and you failed us abysmally.
It was a Brexit election. 2017, we nearly did it.
Hang on. And this time round, what we've done is we have totally reformed the Labour Party. We've brought the Labour Party back into the centre. We are facing huge challenges, but I think the way in which Keir and Rachel have been honest about that and said they're going to deliver that agenda that they've set is a sort of it's a direction of travel. So, you know, we're going to start with babies, and we're going to have more childcare places. We're going on to primary schools, and they're going to have breakfast stops. We're going on to secondary schools, and they have teachers. And all that is a direction
of travel. All I guess I'm saying is, surely it is important to establish, partly because of the future, you know, when we're discussing the future direction over the last 5 years, or over the next 5 years, that what has happened tonight was simply impossible with Jeremy Corbyn as leader, like inconceivable as Jeremy Corbyn. So you would agree?
I disagree completely.
But isn't that like obvious just in the facts?
Look, 2017 we came close to winning. As simple as that. We were 20 points behind and we virtually level with Theresa May when the poll was done. 2019 was a different situation with the Brexit poll. And in addition to that, you had someone who the Tory party leader was a congenital liar. People now have seen through those lies. Well, let me finish. They've also seen the incompetence of the Tories, with Liz Truss in particular, and Rishi Sunak running their campaign.
Okay. 2017, we lost.
Anyway, let's
2017, we lost.
Let's just shut. Okay, let's just shut down history for a minute. I think what a lot of people watching at home really want to know is they saw Keir Starmer go through this election campaign. And I truthfully don't think many of them have ended... I mean, yeah, they were fed up with the Tories. They didn't really end up with a very clear idea of what a Labour government was going to be like for the next 4 or 5 years. Well, so I guess my question is it likely to be a lot more radical now you've got a huge majority than it looked in the election campaign?
I think it's really important after the era, particularly the Johnson and the Truss era, that we start building trust in politics. What we're seeing probably tonight in the turnout figures is a loss of trust, and anger and loss of trust. So that we should never promise more than we can deliver. And I think that's what Keir Starmer has done in the first instance. I think if he broke his promises now and started putting up taxes to fund further public services without having the growth, we'll get nowhere. But there's lots, can I just add this? There is lots that he can do. There is still, the figure of between what we people should pay in taxes and what they do pay has gone up. It's been unnoticed. It's now 40 billion is the gap. So we can do that. We can stop some of the waste on whether it's the asylum seekers, and then we can look at growing the economy and using that money to restore public services in the way we
Can I just ask you that question?
We both want to welcome the election of a Labour government. Of course, we're overwhelmed. To get rid of the Tories is a huge achievement.
Thank you.
The reality is, though, I've got 30% of the children in my constituency living in poverty. At the moment, the first phase, the 6 promises that have been made, will have some impact on that, particularly the school meals elements, the breakfast clubs and all the rest of it.
But you want him to go much further,
the reality
and
is,
quickly.
Well, any Labour government will do that. If you look at the Blair government, the first couple of years they held to the Tory spending plans. Then they become more radical. What Gordon Brown did, started lifting children out of poverty. I think this government will have its set in motion, this first 6 promises. At that stage, then, it will have to be more radical if the children in my constituency are going to be lifted out of poverty.
OK. Thank you very much. Really a big night for you and your party. Thank you very much indeed for coming back to us. We were waiting for the results in Blyth and Ashington. We've called it as a Labour hold. That's not the big surprise of the night. But as we were discussing with Houghton and Sunderland South, it's a question of what's happened to the vote. Can I open the discussion to all of you? You've had time to ponder this. What are you all thinking?
The drop in turnout doesn't surprise me. I mean, I've not been on the stump as much as I usually am in elections, but, the lack of enthusiasm was quite marked when I was speaking to people. And, we're not talking about the Scottish result yet, but I suspect that might be a factor in the SNP showing tonight, a kind of double whammy of a genuine swing to Labour, but also a bit of a depressed turnout amongst SNP votes. But that aspect, it doesn't surprise me, and I suspect that might be a feature of the results as they unfold tonight. I think reform is a big, big problem. I suspect they will not perform anything like this in Scotland, but across the UK, mainstream parties really have to get to grips with this, or this is going to be a continuous destabilising effect in years to come.
I mean, I think look, on a night when someone's just won a massive landslide, taken their party from where John McDonnell put it to victory, it feels a bit churlish to point some things out. But it looks like the Labour share of the vote is going to be quite low, given the size of the majority. Keir Starmer had a negative approval rating going into polling day, which was very different from Tony Blair or indeed...
Does that matter?
Well, I think it matters because we're going to have to decide as a country, and to some degree the new Labour government we're about to have will shape this over the coming months. Was this a kick the Tories out, use any method possible, vote Reform, vote Liberal Democrat, vote Labour, or indeed stay at home? Or was it an endorsement of Labour? Was it a vote for Labour? Were they voting for the change, or were they voting against the Tories? And if it was voting against the Tories because the Tories have not delivered, then there's a big challenge for Labour because they don't have a mandate for anything in particular. They've got to satisfy that desire for a better life. There are lots of promises the Tories made to improve life for people, but as we've heard, there was the disaster over Liz Truss. We haven't talked about the kind of promise of Brexit and then tripling immigration after it and so on. So, it's a big question. I don't want, I've been in the position of being the Shadow Chancellor who came in being Chancellor. I know how difficult it is to get out of opposition into government. So I'm not taking away from Starmer and Rachel Reeves, who presented a very plausible team in Downing Street. But they did, it looks like maybe it wasn't the big vote for them. It was a big vote against the Conservatives.
We're just waiting for Blythe and Ashton. If you're wondering what's on screen there, we've called it, but we're waiting for the declaration. Rob, you want to get in?
A couple of points. One is obviously it is too early to make predictions about vote share, and I suspect
OK, sorry, Rob, I was going to stop you right there, and we'll come back to it.
Thank you.
Northumberland and candidates onto the stage for the declaration.
Yeah, when I said they were walking on, about to declare, they were in fact about to walk on stage and assemble themselves and maybe there for a while. I'm reluctant to... oh no, here we go. We're in.
Look at that hat.
Oh my.
I, Lucia Bridgman, returning officer for the Blythe and Ashington parliamentary constituency, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given to each candidate was as follows. Ian Lavery, Labour Party, 20,030. Maureen Levy, the Conservative Party candidate, 6,121. Steve Leyland, the Green Party, 1,960. Mark Peart, Reform UK, 10,857. Stephen Anthony Salidas, Liberal Democrats, 1,433. And that Ian Lavery is duly elected as the Member of Parliament for the Blythe and Ashington constituency.
OK, there we have it. Labour back, no surprise. But, Colin, before I ask Rob to pick up again, I just want to get you to talk through. I'm going to pull up change and then swing.
It's the same again. The Labour vote hardly up at all. Conservative vote completely collapsing, and Reform this time taking votes from the Conservatives more like, 9-1 rather than what we saw in Houghton. It's safe enough for Labour, but they actually polled fewer votes.
I think if I put up swing, it'll show practically nothing, won't it? Yeah, like a Labour to Reform swing.
Turn out down 4%.
Yeah, so, Rob,
to be clear, the vote share for Labour has only gone up because the turnout is down. The actual numbers of votes polled by Ian Lavery are down, which feels pretty significant. And again, the Reform increase is dramatic. I mean, it's, they've almost trebled the number of votes that they've won in this constituency. But I wanted to talk a little bit about this turnout issue. Pretty much all the opinion polls showed very large numbers of people at the end saying they weren't going to vote. Pretty much all the some of the pollsters believed them, and some of the pollsters then actually distributed those votes in a way that in most cases showed the Tory party actually doing a bit better than other polls. Now, if the vote share is as low as it might be, then actually, I think in terms of the margin of error, in terms of the exit poll, you could end up seeing fewer Tory seats and more Labour seats, because that is what the MRPs showed with lower turnouts built into their assumptions. And I have to say, talking to people in both camps, they are fearful of that. They are fearful that, dramatic as this exit poll is in terms of the number of Labour MPs and the size of the Labour majority, it could be even bigger than this if we get, you know, if those people who said they weren't going to vote genuinely haven't voted.
These things are, to a degree, modelled into the exit poll. In fact, on the first two results we've had, Houghton, Sunderland South, and in Blyth and Ashington as well, the exit poll sort of under the radar figures are pretty similar to what's actually happened in the constituencies. So
OK, I just want to pick up on one thing, just briefly, before we move on, because we talked about it a little bit. Does it matter that Keir Starmer hasn't got this massive personal popularity that Tony Blair had in '97? Does it actually matter in the politics of...
It doesn't matter tonight. I mean, he's won a tremendous victory, so, and George is right, we shouldn't try to take that away from him. I think it starts to matter. The reasons behind the victory start to matter as he starts to govern. I mean, if this is a mass rejection of the Tories, which I suspect it is more than a huge endorsement of Labour, then, you know, particularly given that he's gone through the entire campaign without really confronting any of the big issues that the country faces, how does he then govern, and how does he then deliver on the expectations that that massive majority will create? And if he doesn't quickly deliver, what then starts to happen to, you know, support for reform, to levels of discontent? You know, for my own party in Scotland, that may turn out to be a good thing as we approach a Scottish election. But elsewhere, you know, what happens to that? So I think it becomes an issue. You know, Ed is probably right. There's more of a plan there than has been shown during the election campaign. But the problems right now are bigger, more systemic, more challenging than when Tony Blair came to office. And the tools he has in his toolbox to tackle them, and the mandate arguably he has on the big issues, much, much diminished.
Is it not plausible that lower expectations at Ed are not a bad thing, potentially?
But are there lower expectations? Out of a result like this, well, why can't he suddenly make people's lives feel better? He's got this massive majority. Why can't living standards rise? Why can't we start to see improvements in the NHS? And if that doesn't happen quickly, then where do people go? What happens then?
I think you have to start from the political challenge, which was that in 29, Labour was led by Jeremy Corbyn, and they lost terribly. And there were lots of people, I was one of them, who thought this could not be turned around in a parliament. You'd have to have a Neil Kinnock figure. We were talking to Neil earlier, who took the Labour Party from the ignominy of defeat in 1983 all the way through to 92 and failed, and finally handed over to Tony Blair, who won. I didn't think this could be done in a term, and Keir Starmer has done it.
How much of that was down to Boris Johnson, though?
But you know, I think if you are Keir Starmer and you've won, then, you know, I'm not sure he's too bothered about how much it was due to Boris Johnson or Liz Truss, because he's just won. They had a strategy, and they've succeeded. They've done something which many people thought couldn't be done. You're totally right that the challenge now in governing is very hard. I don't know if he's got a plan. I was saying I hope he's got one. What I'm saying is I don't think that you should...
I think we all at this stage hope he's got a plan.
Because he has just won quite dramatically. I do think that the challenge of this Parliament is going to be very hard indeed. But you have to kind of give them credit for the fact they had a strategy to allow the Tories to destroy themselves. And it
turned out the Tories were really, really good at it. Now, listen, we've done a little bit of explaining what's happened. If the exit poll's correct, a couple of results to go on which have been interesting. But what Jane is here to help do is explain the why.
So, Tom, I think this is going to be quite a confusing election for many people to see.
Not by the end of this segment with you, it's not.
To see the conversation about has Labour actually done well with this whopping majority predicted? I think we just, first of all, let's put that in context. We talked earlier about the mountain that Labour had to climb. So Labour had to overturn a majority of 80 there that Boris Johnson won in 2019. So that's the first huge hurdle that they've not just sort of got over, they've absolutely leapt over that hurdle. That actual majority is actually slightly harder for Labour because of boundary changes, so they were actually then competing against this notional majority of 94. The swing required just for Labour to get a majority of 1 was almost 13% in this election. That's bigger, as we heard Ed saying earlier, bigger than the swing achieved by Tony Blair when he won his stonking majority. So first of all, we have to kind of understand that this is an enormous achievement for a party that is looking like it's achieved the majority that it has. The question is, why? How could Labour indeed achieve this kind of majority and us also be talking about the Labour Party not being as popular as perhaps they need to be? And it's kind of one of those confusing puzzles. So here we have 4 factors which I want to explain to you. The first is, I imagine, and I think we've seen this in the exit poll so far, that Labour's vote is more efficiently spread out. So the Labour Party in the recent elections in 2019 and 2017 had a bit of a problem of having almost too many votes in urban areas and not spreading its vote efficiently across the country. What it needs to do instead is not stack up votes where it's not going to make a difference, but spread that vote much more efficiently. If we look at the exit poll projections, that looks like it's what's happening tonight. So that's the first thing. The second thing that can really help Labour is tactical voting as well. And so if we think about a contest between Labour and the Conservatives, there might be a swing. We've seen small swings between the Conservatives and Labour Party. But if the Labour Party then borrows votes from the Liberal Democrats and, say, the Greens, that would allow Labour to get over the line. There we see that, over the line, enabling the party to get those seats. Now, that looks like it might be happening more in remaining areas of the country. So that's a significant factor that helps the Labour Party in this particular election we expect. We'll be looking for that. The third factor is, of course, Reform UK. This is going to be hugely significant tonight. And the reason that Reform can do so much harm to the Conservatives is that they're almost taking all of their votes from the Conservative Party. This was just before the election. From the British election study, you see 82% of Reform voters there were former Conservatives. And then somewhat surprisingly, perhaps if you're a Reform voter, you're going to end up helping the Labour Party when actually you probably would prefer the Conservatives. This is possible because those Conservatives in 2019 who liked Boris Johnson, they liked Brexit, they're also much more likely to like Nigel Farage. And so Reform can do that much harm to the Conservatives also because the predecessor party, last election, the Brexit Party, didn't actually stand everywhere. They didn't stand and contest Conservative candidates. In this election, Reform UK are standing almost everywhere. And this means that the Labour Party might benefit because the Reform UK share is just taking so many votes across the country from the Conservative Party. And the final factor is what looks to be happening in Scotland. Now, Scotland has been a Labour stronghold for decades until the rise of the SNP. And you can see there the share of seats for the Labour Party dominating in Scotland right up until recent elections where the SNP have been in real dominance in those elections. But the Labour Party has been mounting its fight back in Scotland in the last couple of years. Opinion polls have shown Labour taking much more support in Scotland and the SNP's support falling away. But the crucial thing to understand in Scotland is that things are on a knife edge. And there are so many marginal seats in Scotland, so many tight races, so much independence-based tactical voting, that this could be why we're seeing a very significant decline in SNP seats and a very substantial gain for the Labour Party, helping the Labour Party potentially get this very significant, very large landslide majority tonight.
OK, that's it. The election explained. You can all go to bed now. No, I don't mean that. I'm joking. Please don't go to bed. There's so much drama to lie ahead of us. Jane, thank you very much indeed for all that very clear explanation of what is happening. A night of drama awaits. Peter Smith is in Edinburgh for some of it. Peter, what are you hearing? What do you make of what you've heard so far? What do you make of the exit poll? What is the reaction there?
Well, that's a lot to take in there, Tom, but if we're talking about a night of significant change across the UK, well, what's happening in Scotland is the end of a decade of SNP dominance, and that change cannot be understated. 17 years in government, as Nicola Sturgeon in your studio has mentioned, and as they say, 10 years of completely dominating the elections, both the general elections and the Scottish Parliament elections. And tonight we're looking at the Labour Party in Scotland coming from relative wilderness. Let's not forget they had just won one seat at the last general election here in Scotland, and they could be on course, if this exit poll is to be believed, to have a majority in Scotland. I would say that there's some people here who are a bit sceptical about this exit poll and the accuracy of it in Scotland, especially as Jane mentioned, there are so many marginals, about a quarter of the seats in Scotland, a quarter of those 57 seats, that the pollsters regarded as just too close to call. We're talking about a difference of a few hundred votes could make a big change in who actually claims many of those seats. But what we're talking about now is that something significant is happening when the SNP are telling me that they're not entirely sure they're going to hold on to Dundee Central. That was their safest seat in Scotland. That would require a swing of more than 16% for Labour to take it. That gives you some indication of just how seismic this change is. I also think it's interesting to note that this was a different election here in Scotland. Yes, it was about the future of the NHS, it's about housing, it's about child poverty, about the cost of living crisis. But it was the SNP who decided to put independence front and centre of their election campaign. Page 1, line 1 of their manifesto. The architect of putting independence front and centre of this general election campaign is in our studio tonight, Nicola Sturgeon. She was the one who said that this would be a de facto referendum on independence to give the people of Scotland the opportunity to have their say on Scotland's future in the UK, because that was an opportunity that was being denied when Prime Minister after Prime Minister said no to a second independence referendum. This general election was supposed to be that de facto referendum. Now, since Nicola Sturgeon left as party leader and First Minister of Scotland, Humza Yousaf and now John Swinney as the SNP leaders that have taken over have kind of downgraded that a little bit. But the clear message in the SNP manifesto in this election, as I say on page 1, line 1, front and centre, a vote for the SNP is a vote for independence. John Swinney told me a vote for the SNP is a vote for independence, and he told me as well a vote for any other party risks damaging the independence cause going forward. Stephen Flynn, the SNP's leader at Westminster, told me in an interview independence is on the ballot paper. Now, I'm being told by some of the people here tonight, some of the SNP staffers who are saying, well, this was about change at Westminster, we've been caught up in this election about kicking out the Tories. But the SNP set the terms. These were their terms. This was also about independence in Scotland. And if this exit poll is to be believed, the people of Scotland have had their say, and perhaps the message is that independence for them is not a priority right now. That's going to be something that's going to be carrying into the next election, because what's crucial, Tom, is that although Prime Ministers have ignored the SNP and said, no, now is not the time, now is not the time, Nicola Sturgeon was on the receiving end of a few of those messages back from starting with Theresa May after the Brexit vote, and there was a huge clamour to have another vote in Scotland. But what I think is important to remember is that if the SNP had won a majority on these terms that were crystal clear that a vote for the SNP is a vote for independence, it would have been extremely hard for Keir Starmer to shrug that off. It would have been a thorn in his side for the next 5 years. He would have to address it, have to acknowledge it, that the people of Scotland had an opportunity to have their say, and they would have backed that message. The people of Scotland had that opportunity, and it does not look like they have backed that. It's now going to be much, much easier for Prime Minister Keir Starmer to ignore any future calls. The SNP will say they still have a mandate for a second independence referendum going back to 2021, that Holyrood vote. The pro-independence parties have a majority at Holyrood. But it's going to look pretty weak when we're seeing such a heavy defeat when they put independence front and centre of their campaign in this election. And what I would say, Tom, is that there will be people who are watching ITV tonight who might have previously watched other channels because they're keen to hear from Nicola Sturgeon on this. With independence front and centre, to say she was the architect of putting it so prominently on this election campaign, they've been wanting to know what her analysis is. What next for not just the SNP, but next for the independence cause? What does it mean for the independence cause? And perhaps to see if there might be a mea culpa or two in that assessment.
OK, Peter, thank you very much. That feels like...
I think Peter's been a wee
bit there. OK, no. Simple question, was it a mistake? I mean, you were clearly the architect of it. You had a frustrating time. You made clear that if you won the Scottish parliamentary elections, that you would consider that a mandate for independence. You didn't get any joy, and you were in a frustrating corner. But it was your decision to continue to put it front and centre. Was it a mistake? And do you accept that this is the cause off the agenda now for perhaps at least 5 years?
No, I don't. And I think that's a foolish conclusion for opposition parties to reach, but I'll come back to that in a second. I think Peter's analysis is not unexpected there. I've got a feeling he's had that pent up within him for quite some time.
He's an old sparring partner of yours.
He's an old sparring partner, yeah. Look, I think one of the questions out of the SNP result tonight is whether they've kind of left themselves between two stools on the independence question, because I think, in my view, it wasn't really put front and centre. Having it on the line 1, page 1 of the manifesto gave that impression and allows journalists like Peter to make the point. It was there, it was the big issue, and people have cast the verdict on that. But it was never followed through on in a sort of day-to-day basis in the campaign. We didn't hear day after day after day SNP spokespeople make the case for why, independence was an answer to the big issues at the heart of the election campaign, cost of living, Brexit, etc. So we've kind of fallen between two stools.
But don't you dig yourself into an ever bigger hole if you keep saying independence is the answer and no one's going to give you a referendum and there's nothing you can do about it?
Well, I mean, that's a massive challenge for democracy in Scotland, and that, if it continues to be the case that, and I'll come back to the question, does this set the independence cause back? If the SNP, has a reversal of the scale that the exit poll is suggesting, of course that will be a conclusion. But a lot of the people, if not the majority of people who in this election have shifted from the SNP to Labour, they still believe in independence. They haven't shifted their opinion on independence. So it might take the issue off of the immediate sort of agenda for Keir Starmer, but it would be, I think, foolish to suggest that the independence question has gone away
The problem
in
is,
Scotland.
Tom, that there is just a problem of logic here. Problem of logic. I had this conversation on Good Morning Britain with Stephen Flynn, the SNP leader in Westminster, just a few days ago, because John Swinney said at the beginning of the campaign, if the SNP win more seats than Labour, then that is a mandate for a referendum. But logically, if they therefore don't win more seats than Labour, it's not a mandate for a referendum. It's impossible to look at this result and say, if the exit poll is right, this is not a setback for independence.
That's not what I was at.
What you said to Peter Smith in an interview
point I'm
only
making,
yesterday. So I think John Swinney now accepts the logic of what you're saying.
Exactly.
The point, I wasn't arguing that, although to be blunt about it.
But the point is, if Labour wins more seats than the SNP, because of the strategy of saying winning more seats gives a mandate...
Let me cut to the quick here.
So I think what I was saying is not actually arguing against that, is if you're going to put independence at the heart of the campaign, which putting it on the line 1, page 1 of the manifesto arguably does, then to make that an effective strategy, or to try to make that an effective strategy, you've got to follow it through into the day-to-day campaigning. That's the bit I don't think the SNP...
So it's a setback because your successors failed?
Well, look...
I mean, that's what you're saying. Well, they didn't do what you wanted in terms of making the case, and therefore they failed. And it was
I
their
might have
fault.
failed as well. I might have put it at the heart of the campaign in a more meaningful sense, and I might have failed as well. We will never know that, because we can never put that to the test.
It is a setback.
But I think if you're going to put it at the heart of the campaign, you really then have to do that in substance, not just in rhetoric.
2 questions to close this off. 1, if either of you were in government, leaving Nicola aside for a moment, over the next 10 years, is there any chance at all, in any circumstances, you would grant another Scottish referendum?
The short answer is no, and I was...
Because you nearly lost the first one.
No, but we won it. And I think that strategy of David Cameron's to call the vote then did succeed. It stopped Scotland leaving the United Kingdom, and here we are, 10 years later, and independence is further away than ever. So that is, I think,
if Nicola's party keeps arguing it and does win elections again, could you really turn around and say no?
Well, to Ed's point, first of all, the SNP are doing very badly tonight.
Tonight, but who knows?
And second, this challenge, the only circumstance, realistically, in which the House of Commons in Westminster is going to grant a referendum again, is if you have a Labour minority government that relies on SNP votes in a hung parliament. There's no other situation in which any other party is ever going to do this again. And that was a risk.
You mean never again?
Well, I think it's highly unlikely. And the call...
That becomes problematic if the SNP do start winning in Scotland again.
Let me just... we've established legally that only the Westminster Parliament can grant a referendum. So they can't have a referendum just in Scotland. That would be a kind of Catalonian-style referendum and would be illegal. So then, if you try and imagine the circumstances, in the foreseeable future, for the next 10, 15 years, and you would say the only circumstances where Labour has a minority, relies on SNP votes, because Tories are never going to rely on SNP votes, because the SNP will never prop up a Tory government. And I would say 18 months ago, there was a plausible argument that Keir Starmer wouldn't do well enough in this election, that there would be a hung parliament. There was a big talk, or maybe therefore he would grant an independence referendum. And tonight, of course, that seems further away than ever because he's won a big majority.
In most independence polls, 50-50 for and against. Yeah. But you look at the demographics behind the headline figures, and in younger age groups, and this is not changing as people get older, support for independence is 60%, 65%, 70%.
Further away from it.
Effectively, what you're saying is there's no way, or there should be no way, for people in Scotland to express their support for independence, and that is deeply problematic.
I'm part of the team that gave Scotland that chance. They had a vote, and Scotland voted to stay in the UK.
It should have been
Could I just bring us briefly back to tonight, where the results are coming in? It's only sort of getting reports from sort of Tories on the ground in 2 seats. So, actually, I think that the exit poll would imply that Steve Baker hasn't won in Wickham. But on the ground, I'm hearing that they think he may well have won because there is a big Muslim vote there, and as I understand it, Tories on the ground think that those Muslims have voted for him, and so he may scrape through. But also, interestingly, I think there are deep fears, and we may get this result quite soon, that Richard Holden, the Tory chairman, may well have lost in Basildon and Billericay, where they are expecting a really dramatic reform surge. And he also made himself very unpopular with many Tory members, partly by parachuting himself in, but also parachuting other people in that they didn't want.
Very briefly, because we passed over it on the... If the exit poll shows some pretty spectacular Tory losses in Aldershot, Aylesbury, Basingstoke, City of London, Chelsea. I'm being told that my old neighbouring seat, Macclesfield, has been lost. There are going to be some quite spectacular
big results.
Losses.
OK, I'm going to get up from the desk because over there I have the man who very... well, might soon be running in fact, almost certainly probably will be running our foreign policy, along with the Prime Minister, of course. David Lammy, welcome. The Shadow Foreign Secretary, perhaps soon to be the Foreign Secretary. I guess congratulations are in order. You must be simply punching the air for most of this evening so far.
Well, look, Tom, this is my 8th general election, and if you're a Labour supporter and you've been in Parliament 24 years, the truth is we lose more than we win. These results are encouraging, but we've only had 2 seats out of 650, so a little bit of measure at this stage.
It's quite hard to be measured when the exit poll out there says you're going to have a majority of 170.
No doubt about it. The exit poll will cheer lots of people across the country. But there's a lot to play out, I think, over the next few hours. We've seen the reform vote. I still can't quite believe that the Conservatives are down to the sorts of numbers that are being predicted. That's just my sense. But let us see. Let us see. What I can say is that I do think that this is a positive vote for Labour. It's a positive vote for Keir Starmer. And the way that he changed our party in order to have the promise of changing the country. And 4.5 years ago, I think it was, I remember him sitting in my kitchen at home. We were obviously reflecting on him running to lead the Labour Party. And I said to him, this is a 10-year project. And he said, no, it's a 5-year project. And the truth is he was right. He had conviction. He's demonstrated that. And I think the offer that we set out to the country as well, a measured, carefully, fiscally costed offer, the country responded to because they've had enough of the razzmatazz that gets you nowhere.
OK, we'll talk about the big stuff in a minute because you're about to have this enormously important job potentially. But can we just for a moment talk about the human factor? Because, I don't feel people necessarily think they know Keir Starmer that well. What do you think he's feeling tonight? I mean, is it just unbelievable relief because he's been working round the clock and he thinks he's probably made it? Is he a bit daunted? I mean, what do you think he's thinking if he's sitting at home watching this?
Well, knowing the man, he'll be thinking, he'll be girding himself because he knows that all the results have not yet come in. But he certainly will be thinking, if he is to go to number 10, about the next few days. NATO next week in Washington, D.C. The European political community, which is a huge moment, all European leaders arriving at Blenheim Palace. So he will be focused on the job at hand and he will be sticking to the plan. He set out a course. He will be sticking to it, and absolutely clear that he has to deliver for working people. And the truth is, when we see the tide of nationalism across Europe and in other parts of the world, he knows if he doesn't deliver for working people, then populists and those with a different account of how you deliver will be coming back.
Okay.
And we'll be biting on our heels.
OK. I think what a lot of people sitting at home are going to be thinking about you and Keir Starmer at this point is you will be having potentially to deal in America, if President Trump wins, with a man who you literally have nothing in common with politically. Either of you don't have anything in common. You've got the rise of Rassemblement National in France, equally must be... How are you going to establish relationships with these regimes that you just don't have anything in common with, if Trump wins in particular?
We're democratic countries. We all understand the big democratic fight we're discussing.
Well, you say that,
today.
but he doesn't even accept the results of a democratic election.
Tom, we have a formidable intelligence capability. Our armed forces demonstrated how acting together they can stop drones coming into countries like Jordan and Israel just a few months ago. For lots of reasons, with the world as it is, and the world is a pretty dangerous place, more conflict in the world than at any time since the Second World War. Of course, the United States and our country, along with our partners, will act together, and we will work with whomever the American people decide should be the incumbent of the White House. There's a lot of water to pass under the bridge, I might say, before convention season starts later on this month in November. So we'll watch the ups and downs. But if we do get over the line tonight, I look forward to working with Tony Blinken and Joe Biden over the coming months, and then we'll see who takes the helm in November or keeps the helm.
Do you think Joe Biden will be the candidate in the end?
Oh, look, I've got
different election. I know
too many friends of the Democratic Party reflecting on that question. I have no idea. That is for the American people. That is for the American people. We will work whomever they choose.
OK. Last question. You're walking into potentially an enormous job at a very dangerous time. How worried are you about the state of the world that you're going to have to deal with?
Well, look, the last person who had the benefit of 2.5 years reflecting on the role was William Hague. And whilst William and I don't share the same politics, he was an effective foreign secretary. I set out a vision. It was reconnecting the UK with the global community, and something I described as progressive realism. And in thinking about that, I was thinking of Bevin after the Second World War. Attlee asked him to go out into the world. He found it to be a very dangerous place. He committed us to the nuclear deterrent, and he birthed NATO, which has proved to be so effective over so many generations.
Okay.
So that's the world we face. It's a tough world. We must act with our allies. We must be hard-headed. But we are still the 6th richest economy in the world. We still have a seat on the UN Security Council. We've got outsized soft power. There's a lot going for us if we can reconnect.
Okay, out of interest, are you in touch with David Cameron?
Of course I'm in touch with David Cameron.
Do you speak to him, and is there like a handover that you'll have? Or
I saw David Cameron last week. We had a very good conversation. I'm not going to reveal what we said, but obviously about the details of the job. And we have had very good access talks over the course, behind the scenes, over the course of the last 6 or 8 weeks.
OK, David Lemmy.
Thank you.
Good luck. Thank you very much for joining us. We are going to Sunderland Central.
Ready to declare the result for Sunderland Central. I, Patrick Melia, Acting Returning Officer, hereby give notice that the total number of votes for each candidate for the Sunderland Central constituency is as follows. Lewis Malcolm Atkinson, 16,852. Chris Einon, 10,779. Rachel Sarah Featherstone, 2,993. Niall Dane Hodson, 3,602. Greg Peacock, 5,731. The number of rejected ballot papers was 99. The turnout is 52.6%, and that Lewis Malcolm Atkinson has been duly elected to serve as member for the said constituency.
OK, there you have it, a result from Sunderland Central, but you'll have seen at the bottom of your screen there that Robert Buckland, who was speaking to us only a short time ago from his constituency in Swindon South, is out. I don't think that's a particular surprise because he effectively announced on air that he felt like his constituents were saying goodbye to him, which I think he probably took as a sign. And we perhaps took as a sign. George, you want to just jump in on Robert Buckland? And,
the first thing is Robert, actually had the guts to come out and do an interview on this programme.
We noted that, yeah.
Whereas we're getting a string of very senior Labour people, including the Foreign Secretary-to-be and the Tories... And the Deputy Leader, Angela Rayner, and the Tories have all kept their head down. So first of all, I think Robert gets the medal for jumping out of the trench, but unfortunately he's been shot, and politically, so... yeah, I mean, I don't think he would have been that surprised. That was a seat... Labour can win this and still not get an overall majority, so... it's not that surprising, but this was the kind of bellwether seat that Blair won off the Tories and then Cameron won off Blair, and it is a sign in Middle England. I mean, there couldn't be a more Middle England seat than Swindon South and Swindon North, which will be a more interesting seat because actually if they win Swindon North, that shows there's going to be a Labour majority. But, this is the absolute classic bellwether seats which are starting to come in now. And will determine the shape of the night. But as I say, there are also going to be some seats that have never not been Tory that are being lost tonight as well. Worth just noting, while I'm talking, on Sunderland, the Sunderland seat we just had, again, Labour vote down, Reform vote dramatically up.
OK, let's ask Colin and Jane's comment on that. Can we just bring up the change in the share of the vote? Yeah.
Well, the Labour vote's down over 2,000. Yeah. I mean, if this is happening... more widely, this is more worrying for Labour, right?
Well, but this is what we were suggesting from the exit poll, that Labour were doing well in places where the Conservatives were quite strong and not doing so well in their own areas. So of those three North East results we've had in so far tonight, the Labour vote is up just 3 points on 2019. Conservatives are down by 20 and Reform is up by 16. And so it just shows you that this whole, I don't know what we'd call it, Jane, the Brexit factor or something is just has not gone away.
It's not gone away. It's not gone away. And I think, what's interesting here is just seeing how much that Reform share is doing so much damage to the Conservatives. And, what we will wait to see in a seat like Swindon South is also where Reform has the potential to make an even bigger impact because the Brexit party didn't stand last time.
Can we assume that, the Labour vote, when it goes down, none of those people are switching to Reform? I mean, Reform does appeal also to disaffected Labour voters, doesn't it?
I mean, this...
I agree on a much smaller scale.
You definitely can't assume that.
If we're going to talk about the politics of the next 5-10 years...
Yeah. This requires decent polling after the event to find out exactly what people have been doing in terms of switching parties or indeed staying at home. Sorry, I'm banging on about this again. Turnout down by over 7 percentage points.
But as I was saying to you, the doorstep mood in Labour areas in the final days was drifting to Reform from Labour voters.
And but it would take something so big for that to be a significant chunk of Reform's vote. But it would just have to
it's
be
only
huge.
at the margins on these figures, but it's likely to be at the margins. I mean, I think it's
George
inconceivable there's not some...
It could be the shape of things to come.
Yes, it is happening some.
Let us go to Nina for a summary of what is happening across the country.
Thank you, Tom. Welcome back to the newsroom. Here are the main headlines. Labour's Deputy Leader Angela Rayner has told ITV News it's time to move on from the Tory chaos after the broadcaster's exit poll predicted Labour will form the next government. It predicts Labour will win 410 seats, the Conservatives 131, with the Lib Dems moving back to be the third biggest party in Parliament. The result would make Sir Keir Starmer the country's 7th Labour Prime Minister working with a majority of 117.
It doesn't matter the majority. The point is that the mandate, hopefully, that Keir Starmer will have is that we can go forward now and turn the page on the chaos and the decline that we've seen under the Conservatives.
As the first results start to come in now, Houghton and Sunderland South won the race for the first declaration, and it's a shadow cabinet minister who has held her seat for Labour. Lucrezia was watching. Lucrezia, they did it.
Yeah, they sure did, didn't they? Sunderland returned to former glory. They did it at precisely 12 minutes past 11, the first seat to be declared at this general election. We just had another one come in here at Sunderland Central. You can hear the Labour MP, Lewis Atkinson, just finishing up his speech. And you know what? I was speaking to Bridget Phillipson, who is MP now, again re-elected for Houghton and Sunderland South. And, you know, I asked her about what she made of her victory, but also what the exit poll was saying about this potential Labour landslide. And she says it's all down to Sir Keir Starmer. He's turned the party around. But look at the results here as well. Look what Reform is doing here in Labour heartland in Sunderland. And it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out nationally over the next few hours.
Yeah, we watch and we wait. Lucrezia, thank you very much. If the exit poll predictions are correct, it would mean the worst result in the Conservatives Party history. And it would mean the Lib Dems are set for a comeback. The exit poll is predicting they will win 61 seats as the night goes on. The party's leader, Ed Davey, said they are on course for the best result in a century, thanks to a positive campaign putting health and care at its heart. Well, those counts are now well underway across the country, where in the majority of places there are new constituencies with a host of new names. Paul has more on this and how the newspapers have reacted to the exit poll. Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Nina. The newspapers have been holding the front pages, of course, for that exit poll. They probably already had them drafted, though, in reality, didn't they? And they didn't need to tear them up either. The Telegraph goes quite simply for Labour landslide. The Mirror headline, Keir we go. You can see what they did with that one there, while the Sun says Britain sees red. Of course, the Sun backed Labour just a couple of days ago. And the Daily Express says crushing blow to Tory party in election wipeout. Well, it could be a very personal wipeout for many of the most prominent Tories, including, as we've been discussing, the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt. He faces a fight to defend one of the many new constituencies created by changes to boundaries at this election. So take, for example, his old seat of South West Surrey here, which has now become the seat of Godalming and Ash. And as you can see, it's made up of parts of 4 different constituencies at the last election. Across the country, the electoral map has been redrawn like that because of changes in population. And that means that while in 2019, Boris Johnson won a majority of 80 seats, as you can see here, actually, Rishi Sunak technically goes into this election defending a majority of 94 seats because of those boundary changes. The boundary changes really help the Conservatives far more than they help Labour. So when we're looking about all the results tonight, we are taking this into account in our exit poll and we're comparing against what the result would have been in 2019 had that election been fought on the 2024 boundaries. So quite a few changes, Nina, at this election, but none of those boundary changes, it looks tonight, are going to affect the most important result of all, which is, of course, the overall outcome of this election.
Yeah, Paul, thank you. Lots still to come tonight then. At around 1:30, we're expecting to get the declaration for the Tory leadership hopeful, Kemi Badenoch in Essex North West. We'll start to get some key results in Scotland too at around the same time, 1:30. We're expecting a declaration from Aberdeen South. That's the count for the SNP Westminster leader, Stephen Flynn. But for now, that's all from us here in the newsroom. Tom.
Nina, thank you very much indeed. Well, we've been debating over the course of the last couple of hours what the shape of this new Labour Party is. Going back 6 months or so, I don't think anyone could have imagined that in reality we would end up with an enormous Labour victory in the way that we have had tonight and what looks like a very, very significant collapse in the number of Tory seats. But given how little really Sir Keir Starmer has said about what a Labour government is and is not going to do, I think we've all agreed his election campaign was quite limited in scope. The big question is, what is this new party? Anushka has some of the answers, and Ed has those that she doesn't.
Yes,
At least
I'm
I hope you do.
talk to you
We'll
a
see.
bit about who might be on Labour's backbenches in a minute. But just before I did, I just wanted to show this to you, Ed. Now, this is about reform. and it's where reform comes second, according to the exit poll. Now, we're being very careful with reform and the exit poll because there's huge margins of probability with them. They're a difficult actual party to judge for this. But they're going to come second, according to the exit poll, in 155 seats. So all of these, and then, have a look at this, all of these. Just to put that in context, in 2015, UKIP, on the old boundaries, came second in 120 seats only. And Ed, I just wanted to ask you this one question about this. I was asking Keir Starmer on the campaign about reform, about Nigel Farage, and it was really notable that he did not want to engage. He kept saying, I'm just not going to ignore, I'm going to ignore noises off. I said to him, that's rude to the millions of people who might want to vote for reform. Is there a risk that reform can come back and bite Labour, somewhere very polite, in the future?
Well, I think if you're Keir Starmer and you look at that graphic, the first thing you think is they're all red. They're all Labour. And frankly, who's come second in this election is less important than who's won. And Labour has won these.
That's a bit short term, isn't it?
No, but I'm just saying, look, it's election night and these are Labour seats. And the reason why they are Labour seats is because Reform is taking votes from the Conservatives. Keir Starmer has said that we're not joining the European Union in his lifetime. He blocks off that risk.
Can I just ask you, can I interrupt you for this? Is this why?
Pardon?
Is this why? I was a little bit surprised that he said that yesterday, that we weren't joining in his lifetime the EU. I wasn't sure that he, you might think, well, why does he need to say that? Why does he need to be so categorical? Is this exactly the reason?
Look, I don't know if that was a planned intervention, but he will have definitely have been told, if you ask that question, close it down, because we don't want to see a drift of Labour voters to reform, and we're not joining in my lifetime, he says. He's not Jeremy Corbyn. And fundamentally, though, the angst, the worry about living standards, the NHS, life in Britain, has been hitting the Conservatives rather than Labour, because it's a Conservative government we had for the last 14 years, and that's why all those Tory votes have been going to reform. They've come second, but Labour wins. However, what the point is, if living standards don't rise, if the NHS doesn't get better, that angst shifts over to Labour. That's the risk for Labour. Regardless of Brexit, regardless of the leader, if things don't get better, there will be seats other than these when suddenly Labour is under a lot more pressure.
I mean, speaking to the Labour strategists, one of the big reasons they say they focused on Leave voters was because it gives them that more efficient spread of the vote, which we appear to be seeing tonight. Let's just have a look at those backbenches. I think we can pull up one particular group, which you might say has been a little bit marginalised in the Labour Party, and that is the kind of group on the left over here. So this is the Socialist Campaign Group. This, not very long ago, basically ran the Labour Party. People like John McDonnell, who you're obviously speaking to, Diane Abbott, Zara Sultana. There are around 28 of them, we think, which, when you put in the context of a party of 410, doesn't feel huge.
I've got to say, it's a massive achievement for the Starmer government, the way they have been so ruthless in rooting out campaign group candidates. If you go back to the Conservatives in 2010, when David Cameron and George took over the Conservative Party, pro-European centrist, Conservative MPs were shifting decisively to the right. I remember the first rebellion of having a referendum where I voted with David Cameron, George Osborne, Ed Miliband and me against a referendum. I think there was 75, close to 100 in the next one, votes from Conservative backbenchers who were all voting in that direction. Keir Starmer has been very tough. That number would have been a lot higher in 2019. They've really pared it back.
Tony Blair was less factional.
I think that is true. I mean, look, the campaign group under Tony Blair was comparable to those kind of numbers, but under Jeremy Corbyn, it got bigger. It's been shrunk again. And then the Tribune stuff, I think you have to be clear.
And let me ask about this, right? So Tribune is this middle group, right? So there's actually dozens of Labour MPs who would consider themselves Tribune. They call themselves soft left. You've got people like Ed Miliband, like Louise Haigh, who's going to be the Transport Secretary. At the front, Clive Efford, who chairs it. I've put actually Miata Farnborough at the back. She's going to be a new MP because somebody from each one of these groups told me that she's a rising star. But one thing they do tell me, they say Yvette Cooper, of course, is in that group as well. They do tell me that they plan to put pressure on Keir Starmer on two particular policies, wealth taxes and lifting the two-child benefit cap. Do you think that will happen?
Look, I'm not quite sure who this they is. I don't think that they meet as a group with a manifesto. I wrote a column for the Tribune newspaper. Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were members of the Tribune group. As far as I understand
well, you have to woo them.
And as far as I understand it, Keir Starmer was a Tribune MP as well. It's kind of it's a loose group, but it will change now Labour goes into government because it's backbench Tribune members who have a voice and a significance once you have a Labour government. And I think that you're right, those Tribune MPs who are centre ground within the Labour Party, they're not the right or the Blairite right, they aren't the hard left
so
either.
Soft left in the country.
Yeah, but within the Parliamentary Labour Party, and they will be saying we want more action on tax. There'll be lots of them who don't like that two-child limit, and there will be pressure on Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer from those groups. But to be honest, that's what happens in politics. Interestingly, you know, if Labour wins a lot of these seats in the South East, which maybe it's projected to do, there'll also be rather a lot of newly elected MPs in former Tory seats on the edge of cities and towns saying, Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves, we know you want more houses, we know you want planning reform, but there's a lot of green belt in my constituency, and be a bit careful about your concreting over plans, you know, builders rather than blockers. So there'll be pressure from other areas as well.
OK, we spoke to Robert Buckland earlier in the evening, a rare appearance by a senior Tory tonight, and he made it very clear he was going to lose his constituency. He has indeed, as we've already reported, lost his constituency. Let's hear what he had to say about it.
Well, I would like to add my thanks to the returning officer and the incredible counting team that makes Swindon one of the most efficient counting centres in the United Kingdom. I know you've all been working for much of the day and for the rest of the night. There are many friendly faces here who we need to rely on for democracy to happen. And that's what's happened tonight. I'd like to thank the people of Swindon South as well, or should I say South Swindon, the seat that I had the honour of representing for 14 years through 4 elections. Although it was not to be for a 5th time, I owe a huge debt of gratitude to the tens of thousands of fellow residents who have supported me over the years and who continue to do so at this election. And to those who didn't, I say my good wishes and that my hopes go with you for the future of our town, my home, and our country. And I want to thank Heidi for her heartfelt words, and I genuinely wish her well. She is a person who comes to this with goodwill and the right motives, and I'm glad that on a personal level she is able to serve once again. I want to thank my family, my wife, Sian, my children, who have, through the 20 years that I have been a candidate and MP here, put aside their priorities, not just for mine, but for the people who I served, and for my incredible campaign team, who ignored the national polls and worked day and night to help me in this campaign, and I owe them a huge debt of gratitude. Now, tonight's result means that I cannot, for the time being, be a direct participant in our parliamentary process, which you know I value and love dearly. I'm proud of the work that I've done to advance the cause of autistic and disabled people in our country and people who live in abusive and controlling domestic relationships and the victims of serious crime in particular. I'm deeply proud of the investment that I've helped to secure for Swindon, from the new A&E at GWH to the vitally important heritage work at the Health Hydro and the Honda site redevelopment. But there's much more, of course, to do. I wish Heidi well, and I know that she will carry on the work that I have started. Now, our very political system is...
OK, Robert Buckland, a notably generous speech there to his Labour opponent. George, I'll ask for your reaction in a moment, but Colin, can I just bring you in to talk about what's actually happened here? Let's just look at the change in the share of the vote, maybe.
You will see the Conservative share of the vote has halved, and we're now talking about a very different part of the world to Sunderland and Bly, the part of the world that only reasonably narrowly voted Leave. It's not what you call a big Leavey area, but it seems to me that electors there, like everywhere else, have said, no, we don't want any more to do with this Conservative government, but they have found somewhere to go to express their discontent, to express their dissatisfaction with how things are going. Some of them, sure, have gone to Labour, but many of them, even here, have gone to Reform. This is somewhere where the Brexit Party did not have a candidate at the last election. And for a southern English seat, on the commuter fringes of London, you could almost say, the kind of places that you expect to take a rather different attitude to sort of Reform's policies than would be happening in some of the left-behind areas of the country. This is quite extraordinary. And it just, we're back to what Ed's been talking about this evening. Is this... have they found somewhere in Reform that they can express their discontent because they didn't want to go all the way over to Labour, which means that Labour still hasn't sealed the deal, as I think Tony Blair thought he had done in 1997 in rather different circumstances?
I mean, so very generous, as you say, of Robert to his Labour opponent and a model for how to concede. I just want to pick up something Ed said, because I think it's relevant to Swindon, which is, OK, so we're going to have a Labour government. What about policy? There are going to be a load of Labour MPs for Greenbelt seats across the South East, and Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves's big growth plan is to build on those green belts. And that is going to be very hard to deliver for these Labour MPs. There's going to be strong local objections, and it's going to be hard for the government. And it'll be a real test of whether they're prepared to be bold and risk the majority. And then second, I think European policy. I think a lot of people, I'm of course someone who passionately believed Britain should not leave the EU, hoped that if we got Keir Starmer into Downing Street, he would find a way to kind of get back into the customs union, even if he didn't call it that, find a way to rejoin bits of the single market. During the campaign, he did occasionally say, I want a much better relationship with the EU. If you're the Labour political strategist, you're saying, God's sake, you can't do that. Look at Reform. It's growing. It could be a threat to us at the next election. And at the same time, you're going to have the Treasury saying, well, if you want to pull a lever to try and get Britain's economy growing, you need a better trade deal with Europe. And that will be a real...
Robert, I'm going to come to you in just one second.
I think it's going to be quite a feature that the European policy is going to be off the table when it was one of the most obvious growth options available to a new Labour government.
Before I come to Robert, I just want to ask you, Nicola, you sat opposite Keir Starmer when he was the shadow Brexit secretary, and you discussed this for many hours with him. What conclusions did you reach?
Well, at that time, he certainly gave a good impression of being a thoroughly pro-European politician and individual, and seemed very passionate and sincere about it. I suspect deep down inside he still is. I think George is right.
Pro-European. He's definitely pro-European.
It was pro-EU,
I
Ed.
think he's probably pro-EU as well. Yeah. He's just not in favour of Britain rejoining it.
I think that goes to the heart of the issue we're talking about here. I think George is right in terms of the conclusions that will be drawn from the result tonight. But I actually think it probably stores up even more difficulties because, what's driving the disaffection that has driven people into the arms of Reform, arguably what drove support for Brexit is, falling living standards, broken public services, and arguably Brexit and the fractured relationship with Europe is making it almost impossible to deal with those underlying issues. So, it's this kind of bind that politicians have got themselves into, that both Labour and the Tories have got themselves into. And, yes, it is absolutely the case that Labour will look at the Reform vote and say we can't possibly confront the relationship with Europe. But actually, if they were being really brave, they would take the majority and try to do that and then tackle some of the underlying issues that might actually deal with the reasons people are voting for Reform in the first place.
Three very quick things. To George's point about building on the Greenbelt, when you've got a majority, let's say for argument's sake of 180, you can afford to annoy quite a lot of your MPs. He knows that if he's not going to put taxes up, he really has to do something pretty radical to get the growth rate up. He does need to reform. He does need really to scrap lots of the planning restrictions. They know it's going to upset quite a lot of people, but, he's now in a position to say, for the good of the country, I am going to have to upset some communities. So I think that's quite likely. And the other thing just on...
I hope that's right, because it's what the country needs.
But then on the point about, whether it's joining the customs union or the single market or the EU, one of the things that your party has pointed out fairly consistently during this campaign is the ability of Keir Starmer to change his mind pretty radically when the so-called facts change. His position is not what it was 2 years ago, and it is not beyond the realms of possibility that he adopts a rather different position on joining the EU, one closer to the one that you think is the more rational one.
OK, there's only one person who I've spent more time talking about Brexit with on ITV News programmes than Robert, and that's Jane. I feel, Jane, you have things to say on this subject.
So I think there's a couple of things that are interesting about reform. One is not to kind of almost caricature these voters as thinking that they're just pro-Brexit voters who don't like immigration. Voters are moving from the Conservative Party to the Reform in greater numbers if they feel economically insecure. So a lot of this is also about the economy. It's also about bread and butter issues. But we can also see, and we have a graph that we can show, just how difficult this tension is going to be for the two major parties over the coming months and years. If we thought that the Brexit divide in vote choice was over, we need to think again, because the Labour Party here on the left-hand side has over 80% of its voters who would still vote to rejoin the EU in another referendum if it happened again, whereas the Conservative Party has almost 80% of its supporters who would still vote to stay out. So the Brexit divide is alive and well. It's bubbling there below the surface, as we're seeing also with the results. It's also becoming, again, a very important factor for where the votes are going at the constituency level. So this is going to continue to be a divisive, really difficult political tension in British politics.
OK, I fear we will be discussing it for many, many, many months and probably years to come. But I'm very pleased to say, to talk on a separate subject, which we haven't been talking about for a bit. Baroness Varsi is here, Tory peer, of course. Where would we start? What a catastrophe.
But I think the interesting story of the night has got to be reform. I think following on from what Jane has just said, that actually for me what's fascinating is, and let's see how the night turns out, whether the votes that we're seeing for reform in these constituencies actually translates into wins. I'm not entirely confident that the number of seats that have been predicted on the exit poll may be met. Maybe I'm wrong on that. But there's something definitely going on here with the Tory vote collapsing and the Reform vote increasing. And I think it's really important for us to understand that. Understand that, one, in terms of what's happening across the country, but understand that in terms of what the Conservative Party has to do to start rebuilding from here. What is the kind of party that we want to become and we will become once this election is over?
What's your answer to that question?
I think first and foremost, there was, whatever you think of the politics of this, there's no doubt that the country was left with a sense that the rules were not being followed. And whether that went as far back as Partygate or more recently with the kind of betting scandal that we saw in the middle of the general election campaign. And so whoever comes to the fore has to be somebody who hasn't been mired in some scandal about leaking or briefing or bullying or whatever it may happen to be. I mean, there have been so many different issues over the last 4, 5, 6 years. And I just hope that the party is brave enough to realise that if we are going to be a responsible opposition, and we have to be a responsible opposition, because when parties of government end up with large majorities, they need sensible oppositions to hold their feet to the fire. That is going to be our first job after this general election. Then if we're going to expect the Labour Party to behave in certain ways, then our party has to be led by somebody who's beyond reproach.
I mean, do you have someone in mind?
It depends who's still on our benches. I mean, you can't even predict who would be making a bid for the leadership until we know who is still going to be on our benches at the end of tonight. Of course, you know, people have been talked about, but if you look at what the exit poll is saying, people like Penny Mordaunt may end up even losing their seats. And so, yes, I think I'm going to reserve judgment until I see who's still standing. And then, of course, there'll be lots of new people coming in, and there'll be groupings being formed, and they will find their own view of who they think they should be leading the party. But it needs somebody who, you know, to use terms from another space, it needs a clean skin. It needs somebody who doesn't come with the baggage, who doesn't come with a history, who really can set their stall out and say, these are the things that we got wrong, this is the party we want to become. And somebody who's actually going to steady the ship. You know, you almost need at times like this, not necessarily huge characters, but quite boring, steady people who will get us back into the safe space.
I'm imagining there will be a decent number of Tory MPs who make the argument that what the Tory party needs to do is open its arms to Nigel Farage, welcome him and potentially his MPs in, merge the two. What do you say to that prospect?
I mean, reform has been interesting. It's been at two extremes for me. If you think about some of the things that they're saying about the economy and about the size of the state, about the way in which they want tax to be structured going forward, it's interesting. I mean, certainly there were moments when I've been listening to reform speeches with my eyes closed, not thinking about the fact that it's a reform speech, and I have been able to go through it and say, well, I agree with that, and I agree with that, and I understand that, and that sounds interesting. But then when you see the underbelly of some of the things that we've seen during the reform campaign, including what some of their campaigners have said, what some of their candidates have
about
been
the Prime
saying,
Minister,
then it's
horrendously
deeply disturbing. Of course, then it's deeply disturbing. So if reform are going to become our version of the right and the far right being on the march across Europe, as we've seen in France and we've seen in Germany and we've seen in Italy, if reform are going to become that, then I'm deeply worried. And I'm deeply worried as a Conservative, I'm deeply worried as an ethnic minority, I'm deeply worried because, you know, as somebody who's from the Muslim faith, unfortunately, many of these see that particular community as being at the receiving end of what they see is wrong with Europe. But if reform are going to get rid of this underbelly and say what Farage is saying, which is that he doesn't kind of believe in this nasty undertone of racism that has existed within the party, but actually they are a seriously centre-right party who is focused on making sure we protect our public services, but make sure we have a small state, we have a low-tax economy, we bring down business rates, we bring down corporation tax, we get businesses working again. What kind of a reform are we going to see? And I think much of that will depend on the MPs, the particular MPs, because I think reform is a broad church, the particular MPs that get elected and how many get elected.
Final question, how would you characterise this Tory campaign?
Confused, probably is the nicest thing I could say about it. Really terrible moments, which I think, you know, even the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, would accept from the moment that it was launched. You know, you've been speaking to George. You know, I kind of go back to the time when we were in government. I think heads would have rolled for some of the things. You know, a launch with the Titanic in the background, walking away from the D-Day commemorations. I mean, there were some major moments where it wasn't just the Prime Minister who wasn't thinking. There were people around him who clearly were not doing the serious thinking of how these campaigns should be run.
Thank you very much indeed for coming to speak to us. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much. So, listen, we've talking there about Tory leadership. We've been talking mostly, as I think is right, in the course of this evening, about the idea that we've had this drastic change, this massive change, really. We're going to have a Labour government, unless the exit poll is completely wrong, and some of the early results are completely wrong, a Labour government with a massive majority, and we've been talking about the shape of that. We haven't talked that much about what is a catastrophic night, it looks like, for the Tory party. Anushka, can we talk a little bit more about that, and particularly about those cabinet seats?
Some of the big beasts. The reason everyone's got to stay awake. Just I'm going to show you that.
It could be a whole host of Portillo moments if you get the reference from 97.
So I'm going to just show you the big battle board with a caveat before we do it. So that's all the predictions for the individual seats on the battle board. And remember, the exit poll predicts individual seats and then comes up with a total number, but it's all based on probabilities. And for each seat, we get told how high the probability is. And when I talk about individuals who may or may not go, I'm going to be very, very careful. But what we have made up for you is a board of key players in the Conservative Party. So this has some leadership hopefuls, but it also has some other people who you might think are interesting. Let's give it a go, see if you're interested in them. Obviously, even though it's nearly 1 a.m, I have to remember who is in each of these seats. But to give you an example of some of the people here. So, look, the exit poll is predicting that Kemi Badenoch is going to hold Essex North West and that Suella Braverman is going to hold Fareham. Pretty good for the right of the party. That Rossendale in between, that is Jake Berry, once chair of the party, big figure in the north. We're going to find out about 4 a.m. what's going to happen to him. Godalming, obviously, Jeremy Hunt, that's coming at around 3:30 a.m. And I can tell you that the exit poll puts a high probability on the Chancellor losing his seat. That's not certain. We've got to stay up and watch, but a high probability. Another one that has a high probability around the same time, 3:30. And this will be a huge scalp because another person who might fancy the leadership is Welwyn Hatfield. Grant Shapps. The exit poll suggesting that that is a higher prediction than some of the others. There were a couple of other interesting big beasts on there. So there's Penny Mordaunt in Portsmouth North. I've been talking tonight to some of the members in her team. They are very, very nervous. And I can tell you that that is predicting that she will lose, but it is too close to call. So that one is on a knife edge. And lots of people feel that if Penny Mordaunt makes it through the night, then absolutely she would have a good chance in a future leadership campaign. One more here that's too close to call, 4:30 in the morning. Where are you? Somerset?
Northeast.
Somerset,
Jacob
Northeast.
Rees-Mogg.
Oh, yep.
Yeah.
Jacob Rees-Mogg. That is also too close to call, but obviously tipping away from Jacob Rees-Mogg, which would obviously be a huge result if it comes in the middle of the night. Other people here who are looking like they are safe, like Chichester, that's Gillian Keegan,
yeah.
more on the left of the party, and also more on the Liberal wing of the party in the end, Tonbridge, Tom Tugendhat, who certainly would fancy himself, I think, in a leadership contest. And down here, bottom left, people had thought that he might be worried, but James Cleverly in Braintree. Oh, and Liz Truss also, I think, is up there as well. Norfolk, South West.
I mean, she has a massive majority.
A massive majority. I tell you, at the beginning of the night, we were looking through and the other Norfolk seat looked like it was going to be lost. And for a moment, we were like, is that Liz Truss? But at the moment, it is predicting that she will remain in place. Maybe she'll have another pop at the leadership.
Blimey. That's a thought to bring us all to early silence.
Keir Starmer will definitely second her nomination.
Yeah. George, what do you think about... you have a high opinion of Liz Truss, I seem to remember.
George always starts every sentence by saying, I actually really quite like her, before he then tells us what he thinks.
Before he launches into it.
I mean, no, look,
Go on.
If there were two things, weren't there, that really did for the Tory fortunes. The first was Partygate, which, you know, the Tories never recovered from in terms of one rule for us and one rule for everyone else, and that was Boris Johnson's nail in the coffin, and then the quasi-Kwarteng Liz Truss mini-budget, and, you know, was destroyed the Tories' economic reputation. And what Sunak has not done and didn't do in the first weeks he became the Prime Minister was to distance himself in the same way that Keir Starmer, who served in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet, essentially expelled Jeremy Corbyn.
OK,
he was ruthless.
I'm just going to stop you there for a moment because we're going to go to Newcastle.
Have your attention, please. I am ready to declare the result for Newcastle upon Tyne, Central and West. I, Pam Smith, returning officer, hereby give notice that the total number of votes for each candidate for the Newcastle upon Tyne, Central and West Ward is as follows. Ali Afe, Liberal Democrat, 1,946. Francis Lazok, the Conservative Party, 4,228. Ashton Hector Muncaster, Reform UK, 7,815. Chi Onwurah, Labour Party, 18,875. John Pearson, Green Party candidate, 3,228. Habib Rahman, Independent, 1,636. Yvonne Ann Ridley, Independent, 3,627. And that Chi Onwurah has been duly elected to serve as a councillor, as a Member of Parliament for the Newcastle upon Tyne Central and West constituency. Thank you. The Reform candidate is unwell and has had...
OK, there we are. Colin, I'm just going to ask you to come in as I bring up the change in the share of the vote to have a look at what has happened there, and it feels like it's coming...
The Labour share is actually down there, of course, isn't it? And Reform is up and the Conservatives are down as well. But I would point out there's an independent who clearly took a bit of a local vote there, and the turnout is down by fully 9 points in Newcastle Central and West, a constituency that's had quite a lot of boundary changes, though I don't think that has a particular impact. But Chi Onwurah has still got a pretty solid majority, but what it must look like for Labour, there they are, look down 13%, is it, and Reform are up by 10 or so. That's that doesn't look very good for them. You know, they're down almost as badly as the Conservatives, aren't they?
Ed, any thoughts on this? I mean,
It's a big fall in the vote, isn't it? I mean, 10,000 votes fewer compared to the last election. It makes me feel, as you say, Colin, that something else is going on here. This is so out of line with what we've seen in the Sunderland.
I've just noticed the name of the independent candidate, Yvonne Ridley. Doesn't that ring a bell for Middle East politics, wasn't she?
She was in the SNP for a while, I think.
No, I'm not sure. Was she an MP? Sorry, I didn't mean to get all our thinking hats on at this stage in the evening. But
thinking hard about what's happened here.
There's two different independents.
OK, let's just pull back a little bit and ponder for a moment. I must say that I find it a little bit counterintuitive that we have repeatedly, in the course of this election campaign, stressed how hacked off people appear to be with the government, and yet turnout seems to be down. That is surprising me still, even though
I think you can
you're
be
looking at
hacked
me
off.
like a dim pupil at this point in the evening. Fair enough.
I mean, you can be hacked off, right? But if you don't see another party as offering you something absolutely, something that excites you, then why not stay at home? And in a seat like Newcastle upon Tyne Central and West, it's obvious who's going to win, right? So these aren't necessarily people who are sitting there disinterested in the result. They could be perfectly interested in the result but have worked out that they didn't need to vote.
But am I right to say that the story of this election night as it's emerging is not the story of this election night that we thought it was going to be? At least I didn't think it was going to be. I thought people were hacked off with the Tory government and probably would turn out in sufficient numbers to vote for Labour, but it seems in a lot of areas that, Reform have done so much better than we thought, and people, in the sense that they were hacked off, quite a lot of them went. I mean, am I in the right territory?
I think what we need to do is look at some very marginal seats where tactical voting comes into play, and I should imagine that turnout will be increased in those races that are really tight, where people felt that their vote could really make a difference. We've only had 6 declarations. One of them switched parties only. 5 of those are safe Labour seats. So I think where we're going to see the races tighter, I'd expect turnout to be a bit higher.
Although in Swindon, which definitely would have been fiercely fought on the ground, turnout is also down.
Yeah, but it's one seat.
Yeah, but if you think of the message from the Conservatives in the last 6 or 7 days, warning of the supermajority, don't give Labour a supermajority, they weren't simply saying don't go and vote Reform. They were also saying don't stay at home. And, to me, I asked this to Jane earlier, and I know we can't know. When you look at this, the Conservatives went from 12,000 to 4,000, but Reform's gone from 3 to 7,000. There's a whole bunch of people who voted Conservative in 2019 who've just decided, maybe they can't stomach voting for anybody else, but they're not going to vote for the home.
Because there is something relevant to all of this that's worth pointing out. It's simply that it is early in the night, and we've seen this great Reform surge for reasons I don't fully understand, but on the other hand, I have to say I do respect their intelligence. And, because this is a pretty good result for Labour. Labour think that Reform will get significantly fewer seats than the 13 that the exit poll is saying. Now, I don't really understand that at this particular point of the evening.
One of the things that we have to say about the exit poll is the exit poll produces probabilities. And there are 5 or so seats where the probabilities are high, and the rest of them, the probabilities are much lower. So if we were going to say, we're not going to put nobody's going to put their money on it being 13.
Can I also say something about the independent there?
You mean there's no gambling on this, Chair? Feels counterintuitive for the election campain.
In this election, people only gamble when they know for sure.
Perhaps you have a bet on the result now. Even Ridley, the independent in Newcastle Central, who got over 8, close to 9% of the vote. She used to be a member of the Labour Party. She resigned over Iraq. Stood for the Respect Party, which was one of George Galloway's old connections. And, of course, the reason I bring it up is because I think later in the night, when we begin to get some results in from places like Birmingham and some of the Lancashire towns, we may see that sort of pro-Muslim, the Gaza factor will beginning to play.
I just want to say top memory.
Just on your point about turnout. So far, obviously, Cheon were bucked that trend, but mostly the Labour vote is up a little bit, sometimes just stagnating. Obviously, the Reform vote is up, the Green vote is up, the Liberal Democrat. What we're seeing here is Tories either switching or just not voting. And at the end of the day, again, what we need to see is the actual numbers for the individual parties. I suspect the numbers for the Tories, in terms of absolute numbers for the Tories, will be absolutely through the floor. And that, again, I think just be one of those, big stories of the night.
Something Colin said when we started the whole programme, he said this is going to be about the smaller parties doing better. And it's very easy for us to assume, you know, the smaller parties means reform, and there's a big reform smaller party effect happening, but also the Greens and the Independents, and to some extent the Liberal Democrats, are smaller parties here. If you look at this result here, 2 Independents and the Green and the Liberal Democrat take a whole chunk of votes together, and they may well be people complaining about Keir Starmer, particularly on the Gaza issue, who knows. But the point is that straws in the wind, things for Labour to worry about in this Parliament, it's not only about the reform flank to the right, it's also about the Green and wider independent flank to the left. And, you know, that's part of what he's going to have to manage.
It is a most peculiar kind of position to be in, though, isn't it? I mean, I feel like we're having 2 totally separate, almost, you know, divided conversations. We're having this conversation about lack of enthusiasm for Labour and, you know, this big shift to reform and blah, 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 blah. Meanwhile, we're staring down the barrel of a 170-seat majority from nowhere, which by any standards is, you know, history-making.
Welcome to first past the post.
Yeah.
OK.
And that is the other point. This will be the least proportional general election in terms of the distribution of seats of any in British history, by a margin.
No, I mean, if Labour only get 37% of the vote, with whatever, 2/3 of all the seats in Parliament, I suspect Labour's enthusiasm for electoral reform
will diminish
has evaporated. They're ever going to become the strongest advocates of the first past the post system.
But there is also another point, which I was saying to Tom before the show. In this more volatile world, where the small parties are doing better, even if you win a majority on the scale it looks like Labour would, that is more vulnerable. In 1997, when we won a majority of 170, from the outset, we thought we had 2 terms. And you could plan on 2 terms. You could think about the economy, public spending, the National Health Service over 2 terms. We actually didn't raise taxes for the NHS until the beginning of the second term. If you're Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, even with a majority of 170, they are definitely not thinking 2 terms territory. They're thinking they're much, much more under pressure. They've got to deliver much more quickly than we felt we had to for all of the reasons we're talking about.
But can we just
take away the win?
Can we just talk about that?
It just means that's the context.
Can we just talk about that for a second, though? Because I think almost everyone watching this programme is going to think, I don't really have any idea what Labour's going to do in power. Like, you know, OK, if they're only going to get 1 term, they've got a massive majority. What are they really going to do? Because I don't feel like the election campaign gave us an awful lot of indication as to what they were going to do.
Well, they say they're going to meet their fiscal rules, which is going to be very hard. It may be the Office of Budget Responsibility is going to tell them that you're missing unless you take some action. They say that they are going to not raise taxes, VAT, national insurance, income tax. Very hard to do other stuff on tax.
What are they going to do? That's my question.
They invest in public services, but actually it's quite hard if you're meeting your fiscal rules and you're not raising tax. And they then say we're going to get growth in the economy, which nobody has managed to do in the last 15 years since the financial crisis. George certainly didn't manage to do it when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. So, look, it's pretty
I might dispute that, but anyway, we'll save that for another show.
We really don't have time for that argument tonight.
We will save that for another show.
Right. We'll save that argument for between 3 and 4 if you want.
I think there was an interesting point that someone made to me, which is that, you know, in fact, Keir Starmer presented a very conservative face. You know, first of all,